So welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for our first ever Oxford HR Knowledge Festival that's been running all of this week. And today's session is around board diversity and enabling, in fact, better diversity on boards. And I'm really delighted that, we're able to talk about this today. The concept behind the Oxford HR Knowledge Festival is to incite meaningful and important discussions, within our sector, using the array of experience, of the networks that we've managed to build here. We hope to make this a quarterly or a biannual event, and so we really hope you enjoy it and look forward to hearing feedback from anyone or who'd like to share thoughts or ideas with us. We really welcome those. And I'd also like to extend a really warm welcome and a big thank you to our panelists today. I'm really delighted to be joined by all of you, and I'll spend a couple of minutes now introducing you all. So you may want to give a little wave as I say your name, although your names are there. So the first person I want to talk about is Divya O'Connor. Welcome. So Divya, for those of you who don't know her.
Divya has a career that spans the charity and commercial sectors. She was the CEO of the UK's leading cancer charity, children's cancer charity, Children with Cancer UK, until 2019 in July. And she's a trustee and chair of the development board of Bookaid International, an organisation that operates in 30 countries. She also recently founded and is executive producer of the Charity CEO podcast, where she interviews other leaders in the sector.
In the UK, I would say, but perhaps you might correct me, Divya. Do you also international charity CEOs as well?
Yes, indeed. My second episode of the new season was with the CEO of Heart Kids New Zealand, Mark Longbottom. So yes, I'd love to have more international guests on as well.
Absolutely. So welcome, Divya. Lovely to have you.
Thank you, Sarah.
And the second person I'd like to introduce is Dr. Rachel Barlow. Rachel is, she sits on she's a board member of the think tank called the European Policy Centre. But I should also say that she's a colleague of mine too here at Oxford HR. So she's on both sides of the table, as it were. So she's a headhunter in the EU for the not-for-profit sector. And she has experience working with a number of civil society organisations, business associations, and her area of expertise, she calls herself a governance geek. So is that fair to say, Rachel? Well, I seem to have lost Rachel.
Absolutely. I'm just unmuting myself. Absolutely. I think it's good to be a geek about something. I mean, life can be boring otherwise.
Yes, absolutely. And, and it takes, we're all in our own way, certain geeks towards things. So Rachel has worked with lots of NGOs to assess their, fitness to take on the challenges, new EU legislature, and she advises on best practice and cohesion for public affairs success. Former Vice President of Kellen Europe. A career that spans European and international organisations, and we really welcome you to Oxford HR, Rachel, but also today on our panel. So thank you for participating. The next person I'd like to introduce is Kevin Coutinho, deeply committed practitioner in this space in the field of diversity and inclusion, I should say, and someone who seems to have boundless energy. Every time I speak to you, Kevin, we have such great conversations, and I'm so pleased to have you on the panel today to share some of these thoughts and ideas that you and I have talked about many times. Kevin is an equalities practitioner within the higher education sector, currently working at UCL as the Athena Swan and Gender Equality Policy Manager. And, just to unpick that a little bit for any of you who perhaps aren't aware of what this is, the Athena Swan Charter is a framework which is used across the globe now to support and transform gender equality within higher education and research. And that was established in 2005. And, initially established to advance the careers of women in STEM employment, but now it's being used across the globe to address to address gender equality more broadly, not just the barriers to progression that affect women. So Kevin is also co-chair of the Higher Education Race Action Group, which is a sector-wide body that promotes race equality, and a member of the LGBT Network of Networks Steering Group, and has worked previously with University of Oxford and Cambridge, and he's also chair of the board of the trustees for the Windsor Fellowship. So, you know, no shortage of introduction there, Kevin, for you, but very, very welcome to this panel today. It's lovely to have you. And then last but certainly not least is I'd like to introduce everybody to Dunola Oladapo, who joins us today. She's a program officer for Youth, International Telecommunications Union, and she's also a founder and trustee of a charity of her own called Luton Lights. Dunola is part of the digital inclusion team at the ITU, but previously she worked as a financial analyst at places like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. So a very interesting career already. She sits on the I Will Fund Leadership Board, and her role there is to steer how investment is allocated to increase UK social action. She's currently also the UK coordinator of the Commonwealth Youth Peace Ambassadors Network, and she's a Schwarzman scholar, say that correctly. Dunola, welcome. It's so lovely to have you with us here today. Thank you for taking the time to join us.
So much. I'm really excited for this conversation.
It's lovely to have you. I'm so pleased that we can, hear from you all, because I know that you have lots of interesting things to share with us. So I'll just spend a couple of minutes talking about the format for this panel discussion. The idea is to allow for the best part of 30 minutes for the panelists to share some of their experiences and to answer a couple of questions that we've talked about that, we will share with you. However, at the same time, I would really very much like to invite anyone who's in the audience to use the Q&A box to participate and ask questions as well. And, what we'll do with the second half of this hour is to look at that chat box and try to answer some of those questions if we can. So I will hopefully be able to get through as many of those questions as possible, but apologies in advance if we don't get to your question, but rest assured that we will review all the questions at the end after this event and be in touch to share any thoughts that the panelists might have on answers to them as well. We'll also share the recording of this session with anybody who was unable to join today or who would like to revisit it. So that's certainly going to happen, and we'll be finishing today at 3 o'clock. Sharp. I will keep us to time. So if I interject, panelists, if I need you to either speed up or cease talking, I will do that. So don't be offended if I try to wrap us up a bit quickly. So having extended that housekeeping piece and given you a warm welcome, I think now it's a good time to really introduce the questions that we're going to discuss today. And I suppose, I would start with sort of explaining where we find ourselves now. We're in a tentative post-pandemic world, and I think we'll all have seen that inequalities have been exacerbated. And I think this very much seems to me anyway that we're at a crossroads here. Thinking particularly about the UK, we've seen some of the government promises around a green industrialisation and enabling better opportunities to build back. But at the same time, we've also seen some setbacks, perhaps it's fair to say, around the Commission on Race and Ethnic Disparities, subject of much discussion, as I'm sure all of you are aware, that downplayed institutional racism and suggested that, it's up to individuals and their communities to address disparities. So, I think they do recognise there, though, that there is still underrepresentation at the leadership level of organisations around diversity. And so board diversity is what we're talking about today. And the other thing to say is that every year, places like the NCVO and Akivo and many consultancy firms, both in the private sector and those working in the third sector, conduct enormous amounts of research and share statistics on the diversity of board and leadership appointments. And, you know, this is an ongoing issue. It's something that's been prevalent in my entire career within executive search. And I think there has been progress. Some progress has been made. It's incremental, though. It's very small steps. And unfortunately, it's also fair to say that bad practice does continue, and it's an ongoing issue. So leading from there, you know, and where we find ourselves, I would suggest that now more than ever, the for-purpose sector, you know, needs to be governed by a diverse representation of society. And this is more than ever critical. And my first person I'd like to ask, you know, to talk about this is Rachel. You know, your position as a member of the governing board of that leading Brussels think tank, the European Policy Centre. If I could come to you first, what have you observed in relation to diversity or the lack of it in your experience?
Thanks, Sarah. Big question.
This is.
And if I can throw that even a little bit wider, and to the question of why do we want diversity? Why are we promoting diversity? Why is it perceived as a good thing and understood as a good thing? And what is the purpose? How does that apply to what I do professionally? In particular, for example, headhunting, whether it's to sit on a board or to lead an NGO or an alliance or a think tank here in Brussels. And my area is European as opposed to global, though I obviously advise on global projects as well. So firstly, it's sort of situating ourselves within this sort of EU context. I am based in Brussels. I'm speaking to you from Brussels. This is where I've lived for a long time. This is where I grew up as well, as a Brit, yes. We believe in diversity. One of the mottos of the EU is united in diversity. It is a prerequisite that diversity is a strength. And we do that, we breathe that, we live that on a daily basis here in Brussels. Now, what do we mean by that diversity, though? As I've underlined, we're European. For example, we do tend to be white for obvious reasons, because we're European originating. So how does this apply to the profession as well? If I'm looking for leaders for non-governmental organizations that have a European mandate, there are some factual criteria we're going to look at and some what I would call more subjective criteria which we would look at. And the factual ones would be geography. There has to be a representation of all of the geographies, north, south, east, west on a board. There has to be a representation of small and medium enterprises or service sectors, depending on who you're serving, as well as multinationals. I'm currently dealing with the foundation sector, and this is a very strong argument to cover the full spectrum of foundations on a European level. Also, you know, what are the aspirations of these organizations? Some organizations have a particular attachment to a nationality or to a country because that's where they're distributing from, that's where they're manufacturing from, for example. And from an NGO perspective, maybe that's where it was founded. So it has to have an office there, and maybe therefore the leader has to speak that particular language. So those are sort of the more objective criteria. Turning to the people themselves, which is the asset of any organization, we would look then at their skill sets, their knowledge, their networking capabilities, their ability to deal with crisis. We're living in a global pandemic at the moment, the ability to drive and implement change as well. So those are the skill sets that we would look for, and that in itself is very diverse. One of the big drives that we're looking at the moment, obviously in Europe, is gender diversity. I'm pleased to say, and I'll end on this point, is that the European Policy Centre, which is a leading European think tank, now has a majority of women on its board for the first time as well.
That's very pleasing to hear.
Simply to say diversity can be interpreted in different ways depending on the context in which you are, but diversity is a good thing. It's something that we embrace.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rachel. Thank you. Kevin, if I could turn to you, is there anything that you would add to perhaps what Rachel has said, but also, you know, from your own experience around diversity and inclusion, perhaps moving this towards a kind of UK perspective here? What would you like to add?
Well, I think our organizations and our institutions don't reflect our society. And disability campaigners often say nothing for us without us. And actually, when we think about the for-purpose sector, that's actually critical. If the for-purpose sector doesn't actually reflect the communities it says it serves, we either take, in a racial sense, a neo-colonialist perspective, or we don't have agency to speak for the communities that we say we're meant to serve. So for me, it's critical that we actually get this right. Now, I know from experience, lots of organizations feel they replicate homophily. We replicate ourselves in our recruitment. And for many organizations where that underrepresentation is recognized, then you can actually start to think about what can you do about it. Now, what I know is one of the benefits of the UK is we have lots of data. One of the things that really highlighted some of the challenges of the recent report that came out on race equality and ethnic disparities is the fact that we have so much data that actually says the conclusions don't necessarily align with our lived experience, but also the metadata that we have that's saying, actually, that doesn't look right. And because we have that data, we can then maybe think about this organizationally, about what we can do, and then plan what we're going to do. Because I think we start with many organizations that may not know at this particular point what their problems and challenges are, but they can see that they don't have the right blend of faces or the right mix of voices. And I would say, drawing on my Athena Swan and my race equality experience, but also from the Stonewall Workplace Equality Index, start with your data, look at your data, look at your staff and stakeholder engagement is telling you, and then identify what your gaps are. And from your gaps, you can then start thinking about what are the proportionate measures we can take. Now, depending on how big your issues are and how big the gap is, the effort that you place on a particular area of inclusion can then vary. But the principle is that for any sector not to reflect the breadth of talent that we have is a loss, both in terms of staffing, but also in terms of leadership and governance. But actually, the fact that much of the for-purpose sector works with communities that are often marginalized and minoritized, it makes it that much more important that we get it right. So proactivity and engagement in this space is really important.
Thank you, Kevin. If I could actually turn to Dunola now, I think, Dunola, would you like to share something, maybe following on from what Kevin has said, around the work that you did when you founded Luton Lights and some of your thoughts behind founding that charity?
Okay. No, thank you so much. So I initially started, I grew up here in Luton, and I initially started the charity because in 2017 I was selected as an ambassador for this global NGO called Girls 20, an affiliate of the G20 Summit. And the overall goal was around the economic empowerment of women and girls. So after I went to the summit to represent the UK in Munich and I came back, I just wanted to set up my own post-summit initiative to empower the girls and the women in the local community here through sort of trips, workshops, different things to encourage girls into male-dominated roles. And something that I will say is, okay, so I'm 26 now, and I've had the opportunity to experience board on a local, national, and global level. So on a local level through Luton Lights, which I'm the founder and trustee. I'm a founder and trustee of, through the I Will Fund Leadership Board, where basically we've been working to increase youth social action in the UK. But then now at the ITU, which is the UN's agency for tech, I'm one of the engagement managers for the Global Generation Connect Visionaries Board, where we have young people as well as high-level appointees making decisions about how young people are engaging in international tech dialogue. And I'm saying this because of a point that Kevin made that I just so agree with, and I'll just push a bit further on, which is that when you have organizations that are, charities or for good or, not pursuing profit, the assumption or the goal is that you're making a good difference in the world, you're pushing towards progression, social good, self, a leader or a group of leaders, and the people who will ultimately experience whatever you're taking decisions on are not properly represented around that table in which you're saying you're making these decisions.
Thanks, Dunola. Thank you. And Divya, could I turn to you now, not wanting to put you on the spot and answer that question from, from your role as a CEO, but also, from your experience of, speaking to CEOs and interviewing them for podcasts. But, you know, I'm sure you have experiences that you can share thoughts about this as well. What would you say to all that?
Yes, just picking up on a few points from my fellow panelists. So one that Rachel initially said about diversity being a real strength, and then also something that Kevin alluded to in terms of recruitment practices, where the tendency is to want to recruit people who are very much like ourselves, and having that bias, whether it's conscious or unconscious, that actually is through the thread of recruitment within organizations and at leadership level as well. And also looking at this question of what does it truly mean to be a leader, and how are we as leaders within the sector bringing real intentionality to this question of diversity and inclusion. And I want to share with everybody something that I personally experienced recently. So I've been on a maternity break, and last year I was looking to join a board, trustee charity board, because I felt that, you know, I had some time and I wanted to offer my skills and capabilities and expertise. So I was going through various recruitment processes with boards, and with one particular organization, I must say it was actually an all-white board, and they asked me the question, and I quote, "How would you fit in with our cozy gang?" They actually used the words cozy gang. And my response to that was that I would bring a fresh perspective and new ideas, because my background is different and my life experience is different, and therefore I can bring essentially a diverse perspective. And I'm not entirely sure that went down very well, because they didn't offer me a board position. And I found out later that they actually did recruit 5 new trustees to the board, 4 of whom were also white. So there was one non-white person on the board. And I think this, to me, this comes back to diversity being seen as a little bit of a tick box exercise. And there are some organizations in the sector that actually do it very well and have much more embedded practices and much more intentionality around recruitment, etc. But for a lot of organizations, it seems to be added on as almost as a disclaimer. And, oh, yes, you know, we welcome applications from diverse candidates. But what does that really mean? And also, I'd like to introduce the question of fit. So through recruitment practices, whether it's within an organization or at board level, there's always talk about fit, being a cultural fit. How does somebody fit into the organization? And I would actually challenge that and suggest we need to flip that on its side and actually think, no, how can the organization open itself up so that diverse people can be included and can actually bring their perspectives to the organization? Because that is actually going to create more diversity, and there's more strength in there and more perspectives, which can actually open many doors and many perspectives, and therefore contribute towards the pursuit of an organization's mission and purpose.
Absolutely. I think that's very well said. Some of the threads that, you know, I hear coming through everything that all of you have said, you know, around, you know, thinking about what Rachel said, diversity being quite broad, you know, intersectionality plays into it. It's around, you know, representing the demographic that you serve, as Kevin also said, you know, representing the locality that you serve as well, and recognizing who those beneficiaries are. But also, I'm really interested, Divya, in you know, how you described it as flipping it on its side, you know, and making sure that the organization is actually really ready for when it says, you know, all of the ads that we see today, they all say that, you know, we welcome diverse candidates from underrepresented backgrounds, etc. But, you know, how do we make sure that that's really meaningful and it isn't just a kind of, we feel like we should say this is a token tick box exercise, let's pop that in the advert and then, you know, job done kind of thing. We need to help organizations feel prepared for bringing in people that don't mirror them. You know, when you think about a board, the makeup of a board, say, and, you know, perhaps people who all are of a similar age, simply like that, you know, as I think Dunola talked about younger people on boards. And I think it must be incredibly daunting for a young person to be appointed as the solitary young person on a board when actually everybody else is of a certain age group and a certain demographic and a, comes from the same background. So, and the same goes for all types of diversity, whether we're talking about race or whether we're talking about class or whatever we're talking about. Boards can be quite elitist places, I think, and they can feel very cozy and chummy. As you said, Divya, our cozy group. I think I want to try to unpick how we might, what we can do to try to mitigate against that. Any sort of practical ideas or just even reflections that you might be able to share. And I open this up to the audience as well. I'd be really interested when we come to the Q&A session rather soon. I'd love to hear what you think. But if I could ask each one of you panelists, first of all, for your thoughts on this, maybe just one or two from each of you, that would be really helpful too, before we move into the Q&A session.
Yes, if I might just continue on that train of thought, Sarah. So one of my early conversations on the Charity CEO podcast was with Gemma Peters, who is the CEO of Blood Cancer UK. And this was very soon after the Black Lives Matter protests took place last summer. And we were really delving into this question. And Gemma was very honest in saying that in her organization, they were very diligent. They had an EDI strategy that was published. They had measures in place to track percentages of different ethnicities and the gender pay gap, etc. But what they found was that their ambassador group, for example, or their scientific community group was actually overwhelmingly white. And they hadn't really asked themselves the question, well, what is the organization doing such that people of different communities didn't feel comfortable engaging with the organization? Because it's absolutely not the case that non-white people don't get blood cancer, or indeed that the scientific community can't really be the best there is if that scientific community completely excludes a certain part of the population. And really asking that question and sort of delving deep into looking at what an organization can do to get upstream of a problem and creating safe spaces for those voices and for that dialogue to take place is absolutely key. And that's the message I've been getting from talking to lots of leaders across the charity sector.
Thank you. Kevin, do you have any thoughts you could share?
I think there's 2 points I want to make. The first is it's understanding that we have a problem and the breadth and the scale of that problem, because it isn't just about a face or a tick box. And I think, Divya, you've intonated at that. I think it's very much around actually how structural and systemic is our cultural inequality and exclusion and exclusivity. And us as an organization, us as a we, actually what values are we emanating and sharing and reflecting in who we are? And I think if we start with that, the next, and that actually can be quite actually a lofty expectation because it's a very big task, but you do need to start somewhere. So I'll start with your data, start with your engagement. The other part was very individual. I think I'm old enough for anybody. Dunola, don't feel this is a Knight Rider reference. So old enough to remember Knight Rider. And Knight Rider started with the premise of one person, it did say man, I'm going to swap that to something slightly more inclusive. One person can make a difference. And so what I would ask each of you to do, who's here, because you're the audience who's actually turned up today. So for all of our, just my co-panelists, but it's actually the people that turned up today actually must care enough about it to be here. And the question is, what do you want to do with this time that you're here? Well, the first thing I would say to you, what can I do in myself, in my organization? What agency and power, and that's probably positional power, do I have to reach out outside my stereotypes and the stereotypes that surround me to bring in a more inclusive board and a more inclusive organization? So the action plan for me starts with myself. I look at it very personally first because that's where I have agency. I can control what I do. I'll be able to control everything else around me, but I can at some level control what I do. And so my first thing is to reflect on what can I do? How can I plan what I do to be more inclusive, to challenge those stereotypes? And actually what is it that I can do to sponsor and enable others to get opportunities? Because that's why I do the volunteering I do. I don't have children, but I would like to be able to pass on some of my knowledge and experience to others. And actually what I do want is a world that's better than what we started with and what I came into. And that's what the for-purpose sector is for. So when we don't get it right in that space, that's really worrying. So I say, start with the individual and then work with your organization and see what you can do.
That's great. Thank you, Kevin. Rachel, do you have thoughts that you would like to add to, you know, in terms of this action plan or insights that we've talked about today?
No, but I'll add something. Yes, but thank you very much, Kevin and Divya, for your input. I find it fascinating, and Kevin, go to it. Get them going on the approach. Now I'm coming back to add to your original question, Sarah, if I may, about why do we want diversity? One of the answers is we want inclusion of everybody, and I just want to bring that into the context of my area, which is governance, and set that out as best practice processes. There is a reason why we need inclusion. There is a reason why we need diversity. So if we could set up some parameters and try and practice those within our organizations, and one of them is, I think Dunola alluded to this, it's participatory democracy. It's making sure that all of the voices are heard, that all of the different types of flowers in the field are heard, even if we don't get every single little flower in the field to be listened to, at least we'll have all of that diversity within it as well. And participatory democracy, of course, when, for example, you're going through a change management process, if you implicate people, if you consult them, they will be part and parcel of a successful implementation at the outcome. Otherwise, if you don't get the hearts and minds, you're not going to get a result at the end of this whole maybe painful journey.
Absolutely.
The other aspect was, it's all good to include everybody, but not everybody is equal, not everybody is the same. So you have to have structured deliberation within these multi-level and multi-stakeholder organizations as well. Everybody should be able to have an opportunity to speak. And then the last point, again, within that governance best practice structure, I would see as a means of accountability of the leadership as well. And they have to not just tick the box on diversity because they've got a particular face that they wanted or were expected to have on the board. That's not doing the right thing. You know, we really have to go sort of granular within this and make sure there is accountability on diversity, on inclusion, on participatory democracy, because that's how we move together for everybody's benefit in the NGO sector.
Thank you, Rachel. That's great. And Dunola, can I turn to you now? Your thoughts really on, I mean, I could think of a number of things I would love to hear your thoughts on, but what strikes you as you know, pertinent around perhaps the empowerment of the individual, as Kevin suggests, it starts from perhaps from us ourselves, or maybe your experience perhaps around being part of a board and seeing it from the other side, as it were, you know, as a young person entering a board. What are your thoughts?
First of all, I'm going to say, pardon me if I keep looking down. I took some notes, so I'm just going to be referring to them. I think the most important thing that I think is needed is just a big mindset shift in general, because we need to ask the question: do people really want diversity? I love Kevin's approach, saying, you know, it's about the personal. I agree, because I think we need to ask the question: does every single person interviewing or recruiting, do they all want diversity? Do they all want inclusion? Because oftentimes people want to fulfill the tick box, as everyone's been saying. They want diversity, but they don't want inclusion. And they only want that diversity sometimes in principle. Someone said, diversity is inviting different people to the party, and inclusion is asking them to dance. So you're going to invite someone, but then you're going to be okay with them sitting in the corner because you and your cozy gang, as Divya said, want to, you know, you guys are having fun, but it's like, I'm a good person because I invited them to the party. You know,
it's not enough. Absolutely.
You know, it's really not enough. The truth is, deep down, a lot of people, and everyone here probably, you know, we're often preaching to the choir, because everyone here obviously cares about this, you know, as Kevin was saying. A lot of people who may not be in this meeting right now, maybe some of us are, because, you know, we need to always check our biases all the time, you know, we're always evolving and learning, is that in principle, people want these things, but then in practice, and then that's an internal work, because no one can like dig deep and find out. If this team says, we encourage Black women to apply, I'll look at that and say, okay, they're encouraging my application, but I don't know, you know, what they may be thinking or what's going on. So it's really an internal personal thing. And what happens when we do things like saying we encourage this, we encourage that, but then we're not really prepared for that, or we don't actually want that, is that you end up traumatizing people. You will have the first Black person on the board that comes in there, but then they realize everyone's dancing, no one's including me. And then there's the trauma there, imposter syndrome, you know, or the one woman on the board. And then it's like, oh, speak up. But it's like, have you created the environment for them to actually do so? Mm-hmm. And people can feel things. When you're in a room, you can tell when your participation is not that encouraged. Like, it's difficult sometimes to explain unconscious bias, but I think probably all of us at some point in our life have been somewhere or felt somewhere where we did not feel like we belonged or didn't feel welcome. So that empathy is what we need to think about at the very highest level. We need to think about it, because especially when you're looking at the not-for-profit sector, because what you're trying to do is trying to make sure that people don't have to go through that in the future. But if at the very leadership level, because these things, it feeds in, and you can tell when, you know, as they say, you can tell when the food is made out of love and when it's just you know, shoveled together. We want the food to be made out of love. I hope the point I'm trying to make is coming through, but it's really this mindset shift that we need, and we need to really want, you know, the inclusion as well as the diversity. Absolutely.
Thank you, Dunola. That's absolutely well put. I agree wholeheartedly. If I could turn us now to the Q&A box, panelists, if you could open that box, there are a couple of questions in there that we might want to, you know, unpick a little bit further, but maybe it will be a continuation of actually what some of you have already said here, and which I would really like to hear more of, actually, around empathy and around, you know, helping boards to be ready. The first question comes from a colleague of mine, actually, a dear colleague, Zoe, who says that she thanks us for the discussion. She said it's really great, thank you, and concur with the comments about cultural fit. What advice does the panel have for best harnessing the diversity of thought once the board is in place? So if I could, Divya, could I turn to you? What are your immediate thoughts there?
Well, I was just thinking, as Dunola was speaking so passionately there, that actually a lot of organizations talk about being collaborative and holding up, you know, being collaborative as a value for the organization, but you're really not a truly collaborative organization if you're not also truly inclusive. And this whole idea of inclusion is really around, I think, belonging and enabling somebody else to feel that they belong to that party or to that dance floor or gang or whatever we want to call it. And this is where, to the question about diversity of thought and what barriers might an organization be putting in the way of actually creating environments where you have inclusion and you have active encouragement of diversity of thought and diverse perspectives and opinions. So, for example, you mentioned there earlier, Sarah, about younger demographic of trustees, and I think from recent statistics that NCVO released, I think it's less than 1%, or I think it's even 0.5% of trustees are in the age group 18 to 24. So what more can be done to actually encourage those voices? And also very often, boards talk about wanting somebody with lived experience, so from their sort of beneficiary group of who they may be looking to serve, and actually having that sort of voice on a board. But if we think about the context of what serving on a board means and the legal and fiduciary responsibilities that you have, you know, Rachel, as you very well know, from a governance perspective, as a trustee, how are organizations actually encouraging and opening pathways for people from different backgrounds or younger people who may have actually no idea of what that really means and how to get on a board? Or in terms of time. So it's trustee positions at the moment are purely voluntary positions, and therefore you are immediately putting a barrier if someone is unable to afford to give up their time because they actually need to work to earn a living, or they have childcare responsibilities. So how are boards actually accommodating and enabling people to get around some of those obstacles and barriers? And I think there needs to be a lot more discussion on that. And I know that, you know, Philip Kirkpatrick from Bateswells is really talking about a different type of governance structure, and don't necessarily want to get into that discussion right now, but I think there may be some simple things that organizations can look at, and maybe it's stipends for time, or maybe enabling somebody who has childcare responsibilities, you know, paying for childcare for a couple of hours so that they can attend a board meeting. So simple things like that that can be done within the governance structures and the sort of articles of association, etc., and the rules of the organization that really are enabling this diversity to come through.
Thank you, Divya. That's excellent. And I agree, as I'm sure the others do. I can see nodding going on. The next question I'd like to address is from Wangari Kamau, who says, most organizations have DEI policies, etc. However, very few examine their organizational culture. What are some of the ways we can use to get leaders to audit their organizational culture? And maybe, Kevin, could I see what you think about this? Any thoughts there?
Well, I think the first thing is around asking people. So there are several ways you can do that, either through focus groups, so you get a qualitative approach to getting some data, surveying, engaging your stakeholders, people, your beneficiaries. But actually, any organization would want to, I would hope, that was trying to deliver anything in a for-purpose environment, would want to know the impact that it has and how it's engaging both its staff and its beneficiaries. So for me, the starting point has to be, what is that data? And actually, are you monitoring for a whole range of different things? But that also includes personal characteristics. So that is around protected characteristics in terms of race, sexual orientation, religion, etc. So that actually we make sure that when we're providing services, we're actually thinking about that motto. I often use coins as my reference. And on the 2 pence coin, there is a German phrase, which is probably meaningless to most people in Britain because we don't know the old language front, but it says, ich dien, I serve. And actually from a for-purpose perspective, we do serve. So for me, the idea that we as charities or for-purpose organizations, we have a vested interest above any other organization to ensure that we reflect the values and the needs of our communities. And that's actually particularly important because actually, when we look at the demographics of our society, one end is very different from the other in terms of age profile. So, and that age profile is important because it cross-sections with race, it cross-sections with gender, it cross-sections with a whole range of other indicators that if you're not actually mindful about how you're reflecting different diversity in the way that you're doing what you're doing, you actually may not end up doing what you're trying to set up to do in terms of your charitable objectives. So back to what is governance and what voices do we need? Yes, we need people with treasury experience. Yes, we need people who can actually help navigate us through the legal quandaries, but Bateswells can do that too, I'm sure. But we also need expertise in terms of how we engage effectively with the range of stakeholders that we say we need to serve. And you can see that in last week or this week actually was Amnesty International has been in the press about actually how as an organization it's responded to certain cultural issues around race. And that's a particular challenge when we think about organizations that are working with communities that actually would hope that this organization represented something, because for purpose has values, and when we're incongruent with those values, it's really problematic.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
I could carry on, but I will I leave others to contribute as well.
Thank you, thank you. And, you know, I can move on to another question now, unless anyone has anything they'd like to add to, but the next question is quite interesting, I think, around, you know, the actual limits of funders' views of diversity. Graham Young writes, do funders have too limited a view on diversity? And that sort of goes on from what you were saying, Kevin, you know, around not just focusing on perhaps people of color, but actually what it actually means to be representative of the community that you serve. And I think that's really interesting there, because then that brings in a whole raft of other diversity angles that we all should be thinking about beneficiaries.
Completely. But, you know, we just need to look at the recent race equality and ethnic disparity report. You know, people may look like us, but they don't reflect the lived experiences of millions of Black and Asian Britons. And actually what was put into the report is quite difficult to read. Whilst, you know, I have read it, and there are parts of the report which are very difficult personally to relate to. Now, just because somebody may tick a box doesn't necessarily mean that they have that lived experience.
Absolutely.
Box in one aspect of diversity, but really miss the point in another.
Dunola, do you have anything you'd like to say on that front as well?
The thing is, I think I completely agree, but I think some of the most challenging things, because I understand for the sake of data and so on, it's easier to just bundle people together just so we can say 30% of BME or this amount of this or LGBTQI, and you just want to bundle up so you can have the stats. And it's important to take note of these things, but we also have to be conscious that sometimes when you bundle people together, it may be easier for people to look at them as like a monolith as opposed to like the different individual experiences of people within those groups, you know, that they are experiencing. I say this because, you know, when I was doing my undergrad, I was part of the liberation group. I was elected as Black and ethnic minority officer, so I was working closely with the gender officer, the disability officer, there was another group, the LGBTQIA one, and in my mind, that's what diversity is, you know, sexuality, race, gender, and ability levels and things like this. But then now that I started working at the UN, I'm realizing there's so much more indigenous groups, regions, languages, like there's so much, and that's not all. There's so much more, and it just makes me always try to like remember that it's beyond the data. It's really about people. Me and my sister grew up in the same house, but we're extremely different. And it's just a constant reminder that regardless of, like, these numbers are so important, and we should continue disaggregating data so we can start to find out more and more and more about different experiences. But for example, when we talk about the wage inequality gap, actually, Chinese British women get paid more than white males, and the least paid groups are Bangladeshi women. But then when you just say this is how much women are, this is the gender gap, you're actually not really showing the real experience. And even within those groups, I'm sure there's still differences, you know, the background, socioeconomic background, and so on. So it's like, we just have to make sure that as we continue to, you know, find more data, do more research, ask these questions, when we get the raw data back and we're analyzing, let's just get that it's really individual people being represented. And I know it's so easy to do because, you know, even my work includes that, you know, writing reports in a way that can catch people's attention so people can pay attention. But let's just have the two sides of the coin always in mind would be my suggestion.
Yes, thank you, Dunola. That's absolutely right. I noticed a question from Rebecca Moran, who says that, as Kevin mentioned, those here are people who are already interested and passionate about this. And, you know, it's hugely difficult to get a seat at the table to influence senior leaders and boards. And I really understand that. I can, you know, I can relate to that. How do we drive the conversation when we aren't at that table? And I suppose I would put that out to any one of you to share thoughts on that. You know, how can we you know, help people who are not at that table to be able to influence?
Well, I think one way is by talking about it in public forums like this, or on the Charity CEO podcast and other podcast forums, which then do go out to a wider audience. And as more people are engaging with these themes and these discussions are coming up, actually the leaders are almost not necessarily being shamed, but being made aware that this is not something they can ignore. And if they do ignore it, at their peril, it may be. And therefore, keep having the conversations, keep having discussion groups, create, you know, perhaps your own communities, your own safe space groups, and keep talking about the issues and continuing the dialogue. And that's how you are, and we as a collective will get senior people who perhaps are not listening at the moment, get them to listen.
Absolutely, thank you. Rachel, do you have thoughts on this?
Yeah, on the trigger element, you know, how do we get people to act, and how do we trigger that action? I find that there's nothing better than a bit of competition. And so if you find that there's a particular charity or NGO, every charity and NGO has a competitor somewhere. Competitor for funding, competitor for members, competitor for visibility. If you can benchmark them against that winner outfit that hopefully has embraced inclusion, and then I think that you'll find action coming along pretty quickly thereafter.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. And Kevin, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think there's certain things that funders can do to encourage it. So we've talked about, I think Divya has talked about the messaging and repeating that messaging. I think we've talked about there's a structural aspect, which is actually what our funders asking for and how they're monitoring that. That's that aspect. And then the difficult part is how long can you keep battering your head and having the same conversation as an individual? So there's also a question of balancing that out. And I also do get the point that it can sometimes be quite frustrating because you don't always get heard. Mm-hmm. For me, I care enough to want to keep going and keep battering my head, okay? But I think there's something to be said about how much you can do. And you need to honestly really reflect. And so when I say this, I often say, I want us all to be catalysts and drivers for change. You also though need to think about your capacity to do that. So you're sustainable, because actually we want to be able to do this over a long period of time, because this is not going to happen overnight. Inequalities take a long time, particularly those that are so deep-seated, they take a long time to address. So my honest answer is find things that sustain me. That's what I do. So I find things that sustain me, things that can keep me going. And I actually say this because it can be quite draining. Equalities work is often about, oh, we can't do this, we can't do this, we can't do this. And then suddenly there's an opening. And there's a real recognition in society broadly that there's something that needs to change. Now, waiting for that to happen can be quite frustrating, but you need to, it's a long end game. It's a game with a lot of time that's ahead of us. So we just need to keep saying and keep telling ourselves that actually, what are the things that can help me as small victories? And I call it a multi-anchor approach. That's actually what I call it. It's my way of thinking about, if I think of myself as a ship, I've got to navigate life, and I need to make sure I've got a breadth of different anchors that are maybe fit for different types of situations. And it's important not to lay everything in one anchor. My mum would say, don't put all your eggs in one basket. Okay, it's really important for me to have that breadth of different engagements, which is why I work in different areas and volunteer different things, so that actually when I feel frustrated in one aspect of this work, I can focus on something else. And that balance and that, I suppose, that movement between those different aspects of my life actually gave me sustainability. But it is very frustrating. So I do get the question very, very personally.
Absolutely.
One further thing I just want to add, which is around the concept of allyship and sort of what Rachel talked about as well. It may be that your board and your particular organization is not listening, but if you can find advocates or other influencers in the sector who might be on the board of another organization and get them to influence, because then there's more peer-to-peer influence, that's another way of approaching a particular problem as well.
Absolutely. I think that, yes, there's, to find those allies and to be part of that ally group. I was at a lovely event a couple of years ago now, pre-COVID, where we were talking about board diversity, and somebody used the expression pull as you climb, which I really liked to hear, and I think there is that as well. There is, no matter where you are within your organization, you could be at a very low level, but there will be people behind you, and it's about how you make every action, or your language that you use, the types of communication that you have with everyone around you, how you make sure that you're being inclusive, how you're being thoughtful and reflective about, even the little things that we might say or do almost unconsciously, how that might affect somebody who's not in the position of privilege that you are in yourself, and I think that's something that I carry with me myself, in my day-to-day life and in my working life, around others, thinking of others. I think empathy, I think there's a big piece here around empathy. We're coming up to our allocated ending time. So it's a nice opportunity here for me to just thank all the panelists once again for your time and energy and thoughts and wisdom that you've shared. And you know, it's invaluable, and I've enjoyed every minute of it. So thank you so much. And also thank you to everybody who joined us today and who put thoughtful questions into the chat box and into the question and answer. I'm sorry that we didn't get around to all of them. There's lots of interesting things in there, some of them quite long to read, so I haven't managed to get to them, but rest assured that we will try to capture those questions and maybe gather some thoughts from our panelists after this event, you know, to reflect back on some of those things. But that's all I have to say, really. I'd like to thank you all, and thanks to our comms team at Oxford HR for putting together the Knowledge Festival. I hope you all enjoyed it and look forward to tuning in again, hopefully. And thank you all for participating. It's lovely to have you.
Well, thank you for this opportunity, and I hope it was valuable and the audience enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you to all my panelists and Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you all. See you later. Cheerio.
Bye. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.